This podcast is supported by Secretly Society, a record club offering the best new albums in exclusive, limited edition vinyl colours, delivered to your door each month, with perks like free shipping, members-only discounts, and first dibs on rare finds. Secretly Society is a record club for new collectors and crate diggers alike. Sign up and become a member wherever you are in the world. Just head on over to secretlystore.com.
My name is Grayson Haver Currin. In the summer of 2005, I graduated from college in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. I was writing about music for a local newspaper, and 3 months later, a band of 4 friends and then all their buds moved to town, and soon enough, they became my favorite band. Their name was DeYarmond Edison, and the band's members were Brad Cook, Phil Cook, Justin Vernon, and Joe Westerlund. They also became some of my best friends, and their music and their friendship changed my life. They broke up a year later, and that year of their existence was a period of intense artistic ambition for them. They tried to change their sound, they tried to change how they worked with one another, and that eventually ended up breaking them apart. And more or less the moment they broke up, they started 2 different bands. Megafaun, who made these incredibly strange folk rock records, and the other was Bon Iver. So after that, I pitched these guys and said, the music you made together as the band DeYarmond Edison has never really come out in a proper way. So we should fix that. And 4 years later, we're finally fixing that. Epoch is a 5 LP, 4 CD box set with a ridiculously long book that I wrote about my friends and what they did together and what they've since done apart. Chapter 4. DeYarmond Edison arrived at the cusp of a renaissance for the Triangle's vaunted music scene, especially in Raleigh. Since signing to Merge Records, the Rosebuds, a sharp power pop band with a warm southern accent, had lingered at the edge of breakout success. Ticonderoga was morphing into the uncanny folk of Bowerbirds. A new collective called Buchanan was following in the footsteps of Elephant Six, with acts like David Carson Daniels and the prayers and tears of Arthur Digby Sellers. In the wake of Arcade Fire, the band annuals were becoming a contested commodity for prospective labels. They knew that if they were going to be successful in Raleigh, tapping into its energy would be essential. They arrived during the golden age of MySpace, when making compelling social media connections as a band was inconsistent at best. They had known everyone in Eau Claire, played every event that existed. Moving to Raleigh and learning a new scene's landscape represented both a challenge and an opportunity they could no longer access at home or as yet online, meeting strangers. Justin had immediately realized that Southern heat, and maybe the South at large, wasn't for him. He was homesick and mildly depressed soon after he arrived, he admits. But his hero, Michelle Malone, told him that every time she thought about quitting music, she would read his letter to affirm why she played. This was a glimmer of validation for the riskiest move he'd ever made. Aside from their roommates on Everett, DeYarmond Edison now had no built-in audience or concomitant expectations for what their music was. When Brad handed me a copy of Silent Signs during our second record store shift together, he said, with a straight face, "This isn't what we sound like anymore." So they started digging in. After nearly 3 months of assiduous woodshedding in their little fluorescent-lit room, DeYarmond Edison was ready to perform. Before their set was over, they were offered their first headlining show in Raleigh, the night before Thanksgiving. Sure, it was a fill-in slot when most bands were headed home for the holiday, but the band pulled out all the stops for the visitors. They dredged their collective archives for anything new they could play, stringing together 4 songs few in the audience had ever heard. They covered Pavement's Stop Breathin' with a gorgeous ache, then unveiled an electropop song, Cigarette, that sounded like it might have been lifted from Amateur Love's hard drive back in Eau Claire. Joe had written the last song they played, an imperfection, for his senior recital at Bennington. A discordant but rhythmic accordion piece, it washed a Balkan melody in acid, like DeYarmond Edison's beloved Tin Hat Trio on a field trip. These new songs, in retrospect, feel like DeYarmond Edison nibbling around the edges. Rather than revolutionizing the way they played or made their own material, they were trying on other sounds entirely, as if going to a masquerade. Their updated versions of more familiar material that night were more interesting and telling. The drums disappeared from Dash, replaced by washes of gong. Time to Know, the somewhat maudlin finale of Silent Signs, finally got its necessary frisson from harsh electronics and a piano that sounded doctored by John Cage. DeYarmond Edison played just one more show in 2005, returning to Bickett 4 days before Christmas for another headlining set. They pocketed the money, loaded the vans and cars, and headed straight into the Wisconsin winter for the holidays. Chapter 5. DeYarmond Edison had come to Raleigh in part to reinvent themselves, but they never expected the invitation to come so soon. Just before the new year, they hatched their plan. Each member would pick a concept or discipline they wanted to research as an individual, and then explore as a band, both in their practice space and live at Bickett. Everyone would have 1 full month of research and rehearsal, followed by a show that functioned more like a senior recital than a rock concert. The rest of the band had to be supportive, open, and willing to let the results sway the band's future. They'd start with a set of songs from the first 2 albums, stripped down to their essence. They didn't need to molt that material like some outgrown skin.
I don't remember the pain or the struggle that brought us to coming up with the residency idea, but it was the most democratic. It was like, we're all 4 of us want something. Let's give it to each other.
The opportunity exhilarated Joe. He'd gone to school and struggled through financial aid woes for moments just like this. And the band's transformative potential was the reason he followed them to Raleigh. He began sketching out ideas almost immediately, building an extensive outline for his night that felt audacious. Joe's proposal involved almost 3 hours of music split into 2 sets. Nearly everyone, he suggested, would play at least 1 solo piece. The quartet would interpret jazz standards, like Mongo Santamaria's Afro Blue, which he'd learned from Milford Graves at Bennington, or Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo. He proposed a banjo arrangement of Round Midnight, perhaps not yet knowing that Thelonious Monk had been born just an hour to the east, or that he had played a 10-day stand in 1970 in the shopping center across the street from DeYarmond Edison's house. He wanted to play games, as he put it, with the band, an inheritance from his time in improvisational theater. The sky, he wrote, is the limit. But there were obstacles, too. Beyond the newness of Raleigh, Joe was still adjusting to being DeYarmond Edison's drummer. He worried that the same tensions that had hamstrung Mount Vernon, namely an improvisational impulse versus a love of song, would fester yet again, especially given this invitation to explore and at least the semblance of an institutional safety net.
The 3 of them had this experience together while I was away at college, and really built a bond. And I see the 3 years that I missed out, what I gained and what I lost by not being around them.
On the other hand, what did Justin, the principal songwriter in every band since 6th grade, stand to lose by ceding control over DeYarmond Edison's direction?
We're each picking a project. We're each picking a focus. What's yours, Justin? And his is just be like, I'm already doing all the things that I want to do. I'm fine. It's like he's sort of there would be some of that kind of shit going into it, and so it'd be like, come on, man, we're all fucking going into this shit, man. Let's find a focus and let's do it.
According to my own writing in 2006 and the band's Vegas memories, that's exactly what happened on Wednesday, January 18th. Already DeYarmond Edison's 2nd Raleigh show of the year and the first of the residency.
We went to North Carolina to start over, and we did.
By late January, they'd all picked their areas of exploration. Joe would guide them through exercises in improvisation, Brad would explore concepts in 20th century composition, like minimalism and indeterminacy, especially involving electronic textures. Phil would delve into atavistic American music, especially the Delta blues and North Carolina string bands. And Justin, the singer in bands since the middle school days of Skillet, would encourage the rest of the band to take over. "We will search our own personal histories and emotional context," he wrote in a sort of mission statement, experimenting vocally to find the truest bridge between them and our greatest tool of expression, our voice. January's draining palate cleanser performance, however, dispatched with the notion that each concert should be about one thing. It had lingered for an entire evening in one mood and mode, boring everyone. Why not break each performance into 4 miniature sets, led by one member at a time, so that the night was dynamic? That meant it was time to cram. They no longer had the luxury of presenting their lessons one at a time, or in turn, absorbing them slowly. A natural teacher, Phil patiently explains rhythmic structures and different banjo picking patterns, making his selections feel like DeYarmond Edison's own songs. They echo one another's lines, hooting and hollering in harmony. Between tunes, they sometimes speak in southern accents, like method actors embracing their home's new patois. DeYarmond Edison started at a place of familiarity, playing music so approachable the crowd might have momentarily thought they were at a pig pickin'. It was the bait, and Joe offered the switch. He had steadily incorporated the inspirations of Bennington back into the band, but this was his chance to show his childhood bandmates what he truly learned after he left Wisconsin, while unfettered by a traditional sense of song. The prospective inheritance excited them.
Him going to Bennington meant something really big, and I think all of us were really rooting for Joe to be out there. And it meant a lot that our good friend who was so into this thing was able to study with one of the masters of that thing. I was excited about all of that for him, and I was excited that he was coming back. I remember how much excitement there was that he was there, and I think it was mostly just because of that fact that he was just like really doing something about it. Like almost him going to Bennington was us moving to North Carolina, but he had did it first, and he was doing something for himself that was really deepening his experience on the path.
When Joe began sketching out ideas for the residency, he jotted down solos, who's ready, as an early notion. The hope was to have each band member conjure a specific memory using extended instrumental techniques by themselves, a concept inspired by Graves at Bennington. Joe went first, his own case study. His 4-piece set began with a sequel of sorts to the most esoteric minute of music DeYarmond Edison had yet released, Lift, the luminous prelude to Silent Signs. Turning a cymbal upside down on the top of a drum, Joe hovered in the same liminal space, climbing inside the drone while wondering what will happen next. Called Sea Legs, it was an approximation of his first and last deep-sea fishing trip with Carson's very southern dad, Aaron Eford. "Get your sea legs together, Hoss," Aaron had yelled. "Stay low, follow this way." They came back toward land for Abel and Cain, an instrumental Joe wrote in advance of the residency. Abel and Cain was not a new mode of music for DeYarmond Edison. It is, as Joe calls it now, a Frizzelian folk melody for a band that had ended its first album with a tune called For Bill, as in Bill Frisell. Its central theme is a little bittersweet lick, like a sigh followed by a smile. The remarkable thing, though, is how hard they seem to push the piece. Brad's bass tone sticks like a finger in the rib. Justin chases the melody in and out of assorted rabbit holes, trying to hold fast only to see it slip away again. Phil's high banjo notes linger in the middle, like the pock texture on a piece of stretched canvas. Joe just hovers around it all, lightly guiding the rest of the band to the outer edge of comfort. Inspired also by the acoustic abstractions of Collections of Colonies of Bees' album Customer, the piece expands and contracts around the melody as if it were breathing. It worked, too. Abel and Cain is one of the most exquisite pieces in DeYarmond Edison's catalog, and the tune, especially this rendition, seems like a roadmap for integrating all of their inclinations, for capitalizing on the tension between pure song and pure sound. The night's next selection, visual performance structure, naturally ignored that possibility altogether. At Bennington, Joe had taken a class called Improvisation Ensemble for dancers and musicians with Susan Scorbati. One of Scorbati's systems involved a team of improvisers with preordained roles: the initiator, the responder, the framer, and the environment. Essentially, the initiator moved through a solo and the responder would react. The framer and the environment provided a musical context, like a beat or a drone. The system wasn't new. Its application to a rock band was novel. They all dangled handwritten signs around their necks: Brad the initiator, Phil the responder, Justin the framer, and Joe connecting it all as the environment. The hope was to confuse the usual roles of the instruments, so that, say, the bass and the drums weren't just building a backbeat. Brad was confident in the lead, rumbling with the bass rather than walking, while responding in brotherly empathy was intuitive for Phil. They charged off in the same discordant direction halfway through the piece. Joe and Justin struggled in the background, as if unsure how to divide the role of being the air in the room. You hear the quartet trying to find a new dynamic by inverting the old one, but only getting close. The trial and error, that was another point of the residency. Joe's set and the first half of the show ended with Afro Blue, a Latin jazz standard that he'd had to learn rather quickly at Bennington when Graves told his class to improvise to it. Written by percussionist Mongo Santamaria in 1959, Afro Blue became fodder for John Coltrane's classic quartet a few years later. For Joe, it offered a chance to pursue a different rhythmic pattern with his folk rock band, clave, the basis of Afro-Cuban music, and again to see what would happen if DeYarmond Edison allowed a song to evolve on the spot. Again, as with Abel and Cain, what's most striking about this Afro Blue is how hard they pushed. The song's start felt like water rushing into a dam, ready to break over its top. They sat in that space for 2 minutes or so, Phil fleshing out Justin's lead with his glowing keys. But Justin seemed to grow impatient, spurred by the improvisational atmosphere to run away with the tune. He lashed at his strings and pushed the melody up the frets. The band responded in kind, with Phil maintaining the theme but repeating one note like an itch he couldn't scratch. Joe drove at the invitation too. They spent the second half of the song spiraling through concentric circles of disorder, pushing the standard until it indeed almost broke. I don't ever remember a Raleigh crowd cheering more loudly or longer for DeYarmond Edison than the moment Afro Blue ended, at least until the night's finale. It seemed clear to everyone in the room that we were, as billed, watching a reinvention in real time. For his residency thread, Brad chose the most specific topic, 20th century minimalism, particularly its influence on electronic music. He wanted to explore the microtonal trances of Lamont Young and Tony Conrad, who he had emailed to ask for tuning advice, the pulsing pieces of Steve Reich, and the mesmerizing ambient movements that followed both. He chose to start with the Reich, meaning the band would need 4 keyboards, with each member playing the same ostinato pattern in A with slightly different timbres. On Rug Right, Phil turned his Roland VK8 toward Joe, who sidled up to it with a drum throne. Phil sat behind his twinkling Wurlitzer. Brad, meanwhile, stood in the middle behind an Ovation KS4 synthesizer. Justin, appearing playfully puzzled with his new role, plugged Phil's old, hulking Roland RD700 into an amplifier against the rear wall. As people found their spots on the floor, Brad explained how he'd first heard Reich's music in Wisconsin and what it had meant to him. Now, as he later wrote, he wanted it to instill a more confident approach to new and challenging roles within rhythmic structures. Reich's phase pieces are famously difficult to perform live, often the purview of top-tier music ensembles a half-century after they were written. But barring a few errant notes, 4 keyboard phase in A was spectacular, each instrument arriving in time and moving in uncanny tandem. In the middle, The lines began to crisscross until they merged like helical strands, attached at ever-distant points. As the threads began to pull apart again, the individual notes seemed to shimmer anew, as though relieved to have made it through the tangle intact. It was beautiful. For newcomers, Reich's phase pieces can feel clinical, fascinating case studies into the intersections of rhythms and harmonies, but case studies nevertheless. Brad took care to give it added emotional weight by explaining how this sort of music had made him more patient. I had no patience in my life, he told me, but I could sit down for hours and do this. With minimalism, the same technique of art applies. I had enough curiosity in my lack of attention span that I would want to wait and see what would happen. And now he wanted the band and the listeners to access that same faculty, a source of patience that is becoming alarmingly scarce in our cultural drive to achieve a faster lifestyle, he wrote. It worked. Suspended happily in the reverie, the crowd paused for several seconds before it applauded, as though the piece could have lasted forever. Justin had been a lead singer since he was in 7th grade, back when Skillet was blasting out covers from the Westerlund family garage. With the exception of a few Mount Vernon songs, he'd always been out front, steadily growing into his oaken baritone.
I've always cared about, the sound of things. Like, when I go to a protest, the first thing I think about, honestly, it's the only thing I can think about, is whether or not everyone can hear what somebody is saying. So I'm, really heavily invested in hearing. So I think it really came from that, just trying to make sure that the sound was not loud, but full.
The residency became an opportunity not only to share that idea, but build on it. What better way is there, after all, to enhance your band's vocals than to teach everyone to sing?
That was my thing. It's like, fuck you guys, I'm the only one that ever sings. You need to stop, you need to start singing.
At Bickett, they launched Justin's set like they'd started the night with a song familiar to anyone within earshot. Will the Circle Be Unbroken? The century-old hymn of celestial homecoming popularized by the Carter family and covered countless times. DeYarmond Edison's setting was gorgeous and pensive folk rock, with Phil's gentle organ and Justin's wistful guitar framing Joe's cautious trot. But it was Brad's country croon and the feeling he seemed to find in those words that caught everyone by surprise, even him. His voice wavered in the first verse when he mentioned his mother, back home in Wisconsin. Even 15 years later, Justin remembers being stunned by that moment. And that was the point. For 2 hours, each member of DeYarmond Edison did at least one thing that felt unfamiliar, even past the point of comfort. But they seemed to hesitate only once, during the second piece of Justin's set, a cover of the night's most familiar song, Their Own Bones, but sung by Phil rather than the person who'd both written and sung it. For Phil, the prospect was terrifying.
He would just we would stop, and I'm just like, I can't be you, Justin. No one can, man. I can't sing like this, dude.
The take was so timid that the first word, bones, was nearly inaudible. Phil began to settle into his role as temporary lead singer by the second verse, his voice floating above Joe's fluid drums, and he seemed relieved, even liberated, by the line, "This world without you is fucked," as though he had given himself permission to sing such a thing. Justin joined him at the halfway point, buttressing Phil's naturally reedy voice without overcrowding it. They all sang the closing refrain, leaning into their credo of collective earnestness. I'm so far from not caring, a little more each time. By the end, Phil was practically screaming it. That screaming came in handy for the night's truest test of willpower, exercise in abandonment. An extension of being a Bill Frisell diehard meant reckoning with the polite guitarist's roaring work in Naked City, John Zorn's early 90s band of paroxysmal catharsis that Justin had heard as early as 7th grade. By this point, Brad, Justin, and Phil even sported matching Frizzell tattoos. That was then, for years. Naked City famously traded in 15-second songs, like some art house contemporary of grindcore. Justin wanted to tap that energy by asking each member to howl for 15 seconds over frenetic noise rock, an anti-song circle. Back in practice, Phil hadn't been able to muster the rage to scream. Justin goaded him, this time with a note he scribbled on a yellow legal pad and passed to Phil in front of the band.
It was just like, Phil, like, I love you. I want you to go there. I want you to close your eyes and go there. All the pain and whatever you feel with all this thing, I want you to find a way to change. He was like trying to get me to like let go and go there. You know what I mean?
At Bickett, Justin warned the crowd that things were about to get loud, assuring everyone that earplugs would not offend the band. For 2 minutes, they surged in and out of chaos, with Joe hammering at his drums and Brad lashing out thick, discordant bass notes. Justin ground his guitar against his microphone, scraping away the black paint and sending shocks of feedback through the room. Phil took the final turn, his voice suddenly full and commanding. He not only got in the fight, he somehow won it too. Phil, Joe, and Brad had one caveat for Justin. They wouldn't be the only ones singing at Bickett. If they were going to try something new with their voices, so was he. In the past, they had heard Justin idly humming A Satisfied Mind, a secular spiritual about integrity and honor and the eternal quest for contentment. They were going to cover the song at Bickett, but they had heard Justin hum the high Jeff Buckley version, released only after his death. Brad encouraged him to try to find that register live, too.
You know, it was like, because we were all in this experimental mode, but like my songwriting and my voice had sort of taken a backseat to this playing, this experimentation, this awesome, exciting shit we were doing.
DeYarmond Edison's version at Bickett was hair-raising, the kind of moment that renders a lump in your throat so resolute you remember it for a lifetime. Phil slowly unfurled a droning organ line, bejeweled by Justin's glinting guitar. As he began singing, his falsetto betrayed a vulnerability and restlessness that his baritone had mostly stuffed down for a decade. The wealthiest person is a pauper at times, he sang, climbing the extra syllables he added like a gilded stairway, compared to a man with a satisfied mind. Buckley's version had been seraphic, as if removed from earthly worry. Justin's felt more real, as if bound eternally to the blues that had opened the show. I remember sitting on the floor, stunned by what I just heard, unsure if I should stand up and cheer or stand up and comfort my new friend. The gobsmacked crowd barely managed to applaud. Justin muttered thank you, and we all lingered there in a collective daze. This moment has often been spoken of as the birth of Bon Iver, the first time Justin recognized the emotional power of his falsetto. But that's never been quite right. He had been toying with his range for years by that point. To wit, he didn't even recognize it as some prevailing takeaway from the show, the accident that would become indispensable.
And every week there was a new thing, like, oh, I know how to do Ableton now. I know how to read this weird score that Squint's made or drawing. So it was just like another discovery.
And it was, at least momentarily, easy to forget. The quartet ended the night in a semicircle at the edge of the rug, clapping and stomping to the 4-part harmonies of the gospel standard Come and Go With Me to That Land. Justin first heard the song in the late 90s, during the X-Files episode The Unnatural. Inspired by the spellbinding vocals of civil rights activist Bernice Johnson Reagan on her 1965 Folkways album, Justin suggested it as a group singing finale. It was a perfect synthesis of the night. They sang it by feel, stretching the song to fit their emotional needs, per Joe's request. The material came from the same aged experimental traditions Phil had tapped. The complex clapping and stomping pointed to Brad's phase piece, and they sang, shouted, and howled with unabashed delight, just as Justin had hoped. The audience of a few dozen roared like a small stadium. It is almost impossible to overstate how revelatory that night felt. They had walked into Bickett as one band, but finished the show as something else entirely. An act whose present and future were now entirely unwritten. The night suggested there were no limits to what they could be. I had only watched, and even I felt energized, liberated.
It seemed like this awesome idea, and it really was, again, the most growth I've ever been put through. To have to teach those guys how to sing and also be taught, just the dedication, getting better every single week. We were just getting so good and learning new techniques and trying new things and truly starting over. Where I'm bound, oh Lord, we'll all be together in that land.
That's all for the 2-episode first part of DeYarmond Edison's story, and we hope you enjoyed it. Please join us next week for the 2-episode finale of the band's ultimate split and where the artists are today. To order the DeYarmond Edison box set Epoch, including 5 LPs, 4 CDs, and a 120-page book by Grayson Haver Currin, or anything else from the Secretly Group, please visit us at secretlystore.com. This Secretly Society podcast is an original production of Secretly Group.